When you're studying a book like Galatians, it's a good idea to read it all first, like all the way through. So I read it all the way through in my new RSV version. And it's obvious to me that when you read the book of Galatians, that Paul is angry. I kind of wanted to ask, Bible study is kind of about asking questions. You've got to, if you do it scholarly way, you're asking a set group of questions that sort of are seeking to discover what the passage is really about. Not what I think it's about or what I've been taught it's about, but what it's really about. And there's that series of questions. And some of the questions you ask are your own questions. So it's all about questioning. The first question that came to my mind about this was this idea that Paul's angry is the question of when was it written? Was it written before or after the Council of Jerusalem? The Council of Jerusalem was around about 50 AD, and at that council they sorted out the question of whether or not a Christian had to be a Jew before they became a Christian, because Christianity had been considered simply a sect of Judaism. For a long time, that's the way they saw themselves, because it began in the Jewish context. Jesus was a Jew. He taught Jews. He died on a cross because of what happened there. So the people who were first converts to Christianity were Jewish people, but they didn't see themselves as separating from Judaism. They saw themselves as a continuation of Judaism. But when the message was beginning to reach into the Gentiles, then the question's raised. Paul sees himself as an apostle to the Gentiles, the Greeks, the Romans, and all the other people around about. So he is raising the question about whether or not a Gentile needs to be circumcised, and it's a terrible subject to even start on, before they become a Christian. Now, he's concluded that it doesn't need to happen. He's been there, he had his own serious conversion experience. He's been away for a long time thinking about what this new faith in Jesus means for him. He's a theological thinker. He's a Pharisee. He knows what he thinks about Judaism. But now what does he think about this faith in Jesus? How does it change him? How does it change the way he sees his world? And it takes about 12 or 13 years to think about it. And then he comes back and checks that message out with the people in Jerusalem to see if he's got it right. And then he goes off to teach the world. But in that teaching process, there are some people who, well, don't agree. And so they're following around where he's been, teaching the people in the churches where he's already introduced the faith in Jesus, that Paul's all wrong, and they actually have to be Jews before they become Christians again. Confusing them, upsetting them, setting them on the wrong track according to Paul. And so Paul is a little bit angry. He's angry because of that opposition. I don't think there would be a minister in the world who wouldn't understand something about opposition. Because you bring up these ideas and people don't like them. Or you come with a theology which is different from the kind of the generic theology of the area. And you begin to say stuff about love, and, well, some people don't like love that much. And so you finish up. There is one Sunday where I remember opposition becoming quite obvious. It happens in leadership groups from time to time. Never here, of course. Nobody... No opposition here. No opposition here. No, my little stint here, everybody was lovely. But right back near the beginning of my career, and I can say it was in Victor Harbour, my first church, and I can't remember what I was talking about, but I was doing one of my sermons, as I do, and I got through this sermon. I must have been suggesting some response that I thought the congregation might be able to do. Well, I'm getting near and I've done all that, and then this lady over here on that side of the building pops up just near the end of my sermon and says, we don't need to do any of that, and sat down. Well, what do? You can't really put the lady down. So I just closed the service and went home. Because there's nothing else you can do, is there? What Paul is dealing with is much more serious opposition than that. And I've suffered a little bit more serious opposition than that too. But which relates to the context and the ability to do. So he's dealing with that. It's hard for him. Because if that opposition is happening before the council, and let me go back to that, it's simple opposition before the resolutions come. So he's angry about it because he spent all that time working out what he thinks the truth is. But if it's after the council, it's not just opposing him, it's opposing the whole church or the leadership of the church who've agreed that this is the right message, that Paul is preaching the correct message, which is that in Jesus we have new life. And that life does not depend upon how well you obey the law. That life depends simply upon the grace of God as a gift. Simple gift. And we receive that gift by faith. He's got that right. We all agree with that now, except that we sometimes make up laws anyway and expect people to obey them. Still. Anyway, let me go on. Paul was passionate about his message. He was passionate about this because of the time he'd spent developing it, because of the change that occurred in his life. A remarkable change. A remarkable change. A major paradigm shift for him, coming from that Pharisaic position of law to the Christian position of grace. Now, you know my theme over here. I can see it on the banner. My theme is love. And I get really upset when I hear people preaching or teaching that love isn't an essential part of Christianity. Or they teach people that it's okay not to love certain types of people. And I'm not going to make a list, but you can guess. Some people aren't okay to some Christian people. But for Paul and for Jesus, everybody's okay. All okay. Because God loves them all. The second question I wanted to ask when I read the passage, well, one of the skills that is required of a good biblical scholar is to check out words and phrases that we don't quite understand. We often read over the top of them, we don't bother. But we think everybody else understands them, so it would be terribly embarrassing to say, I didn't understand that word. Well, in my new RSV version of the Bible, and it came out slightly different in the NIV, not much, but a little bit, this term, elemental spirits, is there. What are these elemental spirits that Paul finished up saying are useless and a waste of time? I have no idea. Or I had no idea. You could imagine all sorts of weird, ancient, spiritual, I can't even say that word at the moment. But when I studied it, I found there was a number of different ways of looking at that, but it sort of all came back to this: the established values and principles, or the culture of the culture, the spirit of the culture. The culture that he's confronting is the culture of the Jewish law, in particular. So he's saying that the elemental spirits, that culture which is wrapped up in the law, is no longer required to be loved by God. Never was, really, he says, because Abraham was the first to come to faith, and he didn't have the law. He simply had faith. A relationship with God is not defined by how well you obey the law. That's Paul's point. That culture, that way of looking at the world, has changed for him, and he's saying it needs to change for the Galatians, and they need to reject that, because that's what the Judaizers, that's what the follow-up group has been telling they have to do. So this is not the basis for faith anymore. These elemental spirits, and I think he chose that particular way of expressing it because it's generic. It applies to Jews, certainly, in their legal system, but the Gentiles would also have had a cultural background, a way of seeing the world, which is no longer required. Because now he says it's all about following Jesus and adapting our worldview to our faith in Jesus. And he says that begins, it's a big paradigm shift, a new allegiance which begins with baptism. See, no longer do we hold allegiance to the king, would you believe? Or the country, or the culture. Our primary allegiance is to our faith in Jesus, and all the rest fits into place after that. Now that's a big thing to say in any culture, because for many people their primary allegiance is to the culture. And that's what Paul's conflicting with. A primary allegiance to a culture, when he says primarily, when we were baptized, he says the words, we put on Christ. Which means he says we take Christ and clothe ourselves in him. And he says somewhere else in the same book, it's no longer I that lives, but Christ that lives in me. So the way in which we are to see the world is to see ourselves as revealing Christ to our culture, to our world. So we're not bound up in that culture. We're kind of standing outside of it, revealing something else which is better. A loving culture. A culture with no divisions. We'll get to that even better in a minute. He says you're children of God, who say, Abba, Father, Daddy. Close relationship, close, loving relationship with this God. You're no longer bound to the law. He says, you're heirs. You're heirs of the promise. The promises that were given to Abraham, you're heirs of those promises. You're not infants. You're not minors, because the minor has somebody else to look after their property. You are the heirs. You're really special. You're getting even more special as we get through this. You're free. You're not slaves to anything. You're free to love. You're free to express yourself. You're free to be a human being who is a child of God, heirs of the Father, and free. This is getting better and better as it goes along. You're children of grace. You receive the grace of God. You're not living in fear of what you might not do right. It's not about how good you are. It's simply about how good God's grace is. It is a growing program. It's a growth program. We are expected to grow into the love of God. And this is kind of expressed here, where he says, immediately after he talks about this baptismal exercise, this baptismal change that we go through, he says straight away, after that, there is no longer male or female. So what does that say to all our gender issues that we're going through at the moment? There's no longer gender. Everyone's loved by God. There's no longer slave or free. Their status has all changed. There's no longer Jew and Gentile. I just messed them up. They're in the wrong order, but it doesn't matter. All our nationalities, all our cultures no longer matter. We're all multicultural. We're all together. We're all one. Whatever language we speak, whatever colour we are, whatever colour our hair is, or the shape of our body, whatever we are, there is no divisions here. Jesus has made us all children of God, heirs, free, full of grace. We don't live in an us and them world. Is this reflective of the culture we see around us or in the church? Maybe Paul's message to the Galatians is relevant to our times as well. Maybe we have taken a step backwards. Well, I know we have. The church has been really good at re-establishing nitpicky laws. In my own lifetime, there's been all sorts of little laws that qualified us for being a Christian. So much so that people said, I can't go to church because my clothes aren't good enough. And children were not allowed to take communion because they were children. Can I say that too? No longer any children or old people. Can I add that one to the list? Because we're all children of God. Really, really special. We are inspired by the Spirit of God to reveal the qualities and gifts of that Spirit. Now, I'm not going to steal that because that's probably next week's sermon. And I won't be doing it. Graham will. Paul's point, after all that wonderful revealing of who you are now, after telling you what fantastic people you are because of your faith in Jesus and how gracious God has been to you, he sort of shouts out to them, as he's done earlier, who fooled you? What stupid decision was it to go back on all that? Why would you want to go back into that old culture? Those elemental spirits. Why would you head back that way? When you know the love of God so intimately. And he's really frustrated. I understand his frustration. I get frustrated when I hear people diminishing others. Because we hold this passionately. Why would we 21st century people do that? Well, first of all, we've had a long culture of it. It didn't take long for the church to set up structures and laws and organisation to exclude people rather than include them, and we're many, many years later still holding the Christendom culture that was there until recently. It sort of all evaporated. It did. 1,500 years of history suddenly evaporated. The church wasn't in control anymore. It must be terribly hard for us to understand that. But the culture we were promoting wasn't necessarily a loving Christian culture. And maybe that was a good thing that we lost that power. But it's hard to give up long-held cultures. We also want to go back to the familiar. Now, I grew up in a period of time, and where does my music appreciation come from? When I was a teenager. Where does my understanding of church come from? Probably when I was a teenager. I'm still an infant in that context. Like Paul says, we're under the control. Sometime or other we've got to grow up. And understand that the familiar isn't necessarily the truth. I like this one because Paul's dealing with authority figures. Paul has come to them as an authority figure and he's preached a sermon. He's preached his message, he's shared with them the gospel of love and grace, freedom and new life. All as a gift. But authority figures come along and they preach their message. I do. And I'm telling you now, question me. And question anybody who stands up here and says what they say. Understand that the question is the basis of all learning. If nothing else, God wants you to learn and grow and become. Authority figures are just like you, except they've learned a bit more. And they may be wrong. They just may be wrong. And often are. Even me. It's hard to be different. In our culture, we like to look the same. So if the others around us look like that, then probably that's the right one. But not necessarily so. Throughout history, the church has been confronted, Christians have been confronted by new truths. And I'm not going to list those either, but you can kind of think about that. We haven't had a very good history of accepting new truths. We've had a tendency to go back to what we think are eternal truths that may not be so. And when somebody comes along and says, that's not so anymore, I've discovered this scientifically, or I've discovered this historically, or I've discovered this culturally, we have a really bad record of accepting those new truths, except when after a few generations go through, we suddenly realise it's the norm, so we accept it then. What God is calling the Galatians to, through Paul, what we are being called to after Christendom died, is to go through a massive, massive paradigm shift. We have to discover new ways to share the gospel. The gospel doesn't change, the message doesn't change, but the way we do it must change. We don't know how to do it. And so we're a bit stuck, aren't we? We are in an era when, after what I call the purge, we've been purged. And now we're coming out of that purge, discovering new truths and new ways of revealing truths. Letting go of old lies and old ways. I have a favourite question, and you know I do, because I've told you before. I think it's the foundation of that new era. I think it's the question that Jesus gives us. I think it's the question that Paul gives us. I think it's the question that the New Testament constantly introduces, in other words, of course. How am I going to love this one? How am I going to value this one? How am I going to esteem this one? How am I going to show care for this one? Whoever this one is, whether they look like me or don't. whether they speak my language or don't, whether they have a different understanding of the world. This is the question which we have to face. Paul sees it as an equalising question, and later on he sees it as a gifted question. How is this love going to be expressed? It's a question we must face. Amen.